Well, good morning. I'm recording this on yesterday for you from Arkansas, right here at Camp Ozark. We have just sent home a fourth session, which is our most popular session, although all of our sessions have been full. We've been really blessed by that. Tomorrow starts our last 2-week session here. We have 2 weeks plus 1 week left for underserved children at Camp OTX. And then we have 2 weeks left at our camp for underserved children in Northwest Arkansas. Speaking of Camp OTX, that's our Texas camp. Van and Deborah came and spent almost a week with us last week, where we were able to be blessed with Van's amazing video and photography skills. He helped us out a lot. And Deborah, it was just a great have her there as she helped Van, and also we got to visit with her. So we're very thankful, not only for their skills, but for their friendship and the fellowship that they provided us during the summer. We hope all of you are doing well. We hope the long-awaited, well-planned trip to the Space Cowboys game was a lot of fun. We wish the Hanses a happy anniversary. That was a little earlier this month. We look forward to being back with you in the fairly near future. We continue to pray for you. Carolyn so faithfully sends out the newsletter with all the prayer requests, and we're just thankful for you. So today we've been in Luke 17. We're going to take a break from Luke 17, and of course it's filled with so many lessons, so many object lessons and parables as Jesus travels to his final destiny while teaching his followers and the curiosity seekers, and then admonishing the Pharisees who were not curious. They were simply judgmental. But today we go to John 11, where we find the story of Lazarus, brother of Mary and Martha, who of course were close followers of Jesus. Now this is not, and I repeat, this is not the same Lazarus that Jesus referred to in last week's parable. This Lazarus is a real person, a really close friend of Jesus, maybe almost like a brother. And I think all of us pretty much know the story of Lazarus in a nutshell. He gets sick, he dies. Jesus raised him from the dead, and that's a foreshadowing of what is to come in Jesus' own life. Now, the story of Lazarus, though, accompanies much more than that, and it's found in the first 44 verses of John 11. Now, because of that, so many verses, I'm not going to read them all at one time, but I would encourage you to do so when you get a chance. Instead, let's break it down a little bit at a time, and I'm going to forewarn you, I think we'll probably spend more than one Sunday in this chapter because I think there's a whole lot in it. Here we go. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, that's about 2 miles from Jerusalem, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to him, Lord, the one you love is sick. That kind of tells us how close a relationship he had with Lazarus. When Jesus, heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. Now, he wasn't saying this to them. He was basically saying it to his disciples. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Now, that almost seems like an oxymoron. It makes a big deal of how much he loved the family, and then it makes a big deal of the fact he didn't do anything, didn't go anywhere. So I think as we break it down, the first thing that is important to remember about this particular passage is that it is from the Gospel of John. Remember, John is not a synoptic gospel. Unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, especially Luke, where we have been for the last couple of months, it's not a historical accounting of the facts. John's gospel, written much later, 80 years or so later, after the synoptics, instead is a deeply theological gospel, the purpose of which is to confirm, to conclude, and to encourage others that Jesus is without question the Messiah, the Son of God. In the Gospel of John, things are not always chronological, but in John's Gospel, the story of Lazarus seems to be. It's kind of situated right after the Good Shepherd discourse that's found in John, and just before Jesus' anointing and final entry into Jerusalem. The story itself is a pivotal to the plot of John's gospel and lifts up the central themes of his gospel. So it's an important story. So what we have is Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, three adult siblings from Bethany. They're friends and close followers of Jesus. And Lazarus has fallen gravely ill, and his sisters, Mary and Martha, send for Jesus, who's across the Jordan River. So how does Jesus respond? To me, Jesus' response at first blush seems to be surprisingly nonchalant. Here it is in verses 5 and 6 of chapter 11. Though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was going, or where he was. I don't think there was any big thing going on there. Nothing pivotal. He just did it. Why? It would be kind of like if someone very close to you was gravely ill and dying with only days, if not hours to live, and you get a call from their son or their daughter or their spouse asking you to come. They need you. And yet you say, well, okay, I'm a little busy right now, or I'm on vacation right now. I'll get there in a couple of days. Now, how would you feel? I suspect you would feel the same way Mary and Martha felt or feel in verses 21 and 32, which we'll talk about a little bit. But verse 21, when Jesus finally gets there, Martha says this, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Then in verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. The same thing, the same reaction. Now, let me ask you a question. Isn't this how we feel when we're anguished? When we want to be relieved of our anguish? When we want help? When we want support? And when we want Jesus to act immediately in our timing for our benefit? So, if Jesus is this all-loving Savior, why didn't Jesus come immediately? The passage is clear. He was very close to all three members of the family. Mary and Martha were followers who often traveled with Jesus. They played some pivotal roles in his ministry. They were truly like family to Jesus. In fact, later on in verse 35, the shortest verse in the Bible, it shows us that Jesus was moved to tears because Lazarus had passed away, and his humanity and compassion are on full display. Where were you, Lord? Well, let me first say this. Like us, when personal tragedy or extreme difficulty strike, don't we often ask Jesus the same question they ask? Where were you? Why didn't you come? Why didn't you minister to me immediately? How could you have let this happen? Couldn't you have prevented all this horrible pain and heartache? But look carefully at verse 4. The reason Jesus did not come immediately, now this is a critical verse, not only for this passage, but for the gospel, for the ultimate meaning and purpose of our lives. It's big. He says, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus didn't come because he knew the ultimate purpose of this event. He knows the ultimate purpose of the events of our lives. And remember, the ultimate purpose of all of our lives, regardless of our circumstances, is for the glory of God. Romans 8:28, a very familiar passage, tells us clearly that in each and every situation of life, God is working for good. He didn't cause necessarily Lazarus to be zapped. He doesn't cause the anguish in your life. But in those situations, he is working for good so that you will be drawn closer to him, but mainly so that he will be glorified, so others will be drawn closer to him. So, what can we learn from this passage and from this series of events? And how can we learn to trust fully and faithfully when we are in the midst of similar events? Now, I think that should be your primary topic of discussion at the conclusion of this lesson. So, moving on. Now we have Jesus staying put for a couple of days until the timing is perfect to bring about his purpose, the ultimate glory of God. So look at verse 7 through 16. And then he said to his disciples, "Okay, let's go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, yet you're going back?" Jesus answered, I love this, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daylight will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." Catch his drift? After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep, just like us. It's beyond our paradigm. So then Jesus told them plainly, "Look, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." So now we're starting to see one of the purposes of why Jesus did not immediately go. He knew that his disciples were going to have full faith. He knew that he was going to experience the exact same thing that Lazarus experienced. He knew that that particular experience at that particular time was going to require extreme faith of his disciples. And therefore, he gave them a benchmark. A benchmark. Here's what I thought funny, verse 16. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." That's kind of interesting to think. But anyway, so now, though, if you pay attention to those verses and pay attention to the reaction of the disciples, the narrative brings forward a different issue. And what is that issue? It's fear. Jesus' disciples are fearful of what will happen to them if they travel this path. What are they afraid of? They're afraid of their physical safety. Sometimes when we're asked to travel a particular path from Jesus, we're afraid of our physical safety. They're afraid of his physical safety, just like we might be afraid for the physical safety of our family. They are also, and maybe most assuredly, afraid of the difficulty and uncertainty that lies ahead. They want to know how it turns out. And that's so often what the fear that grips us is when God puts us through a circumstance or asks us to do something out of the comfort zone, we are fearful of what the response of others will be and what the response in our circumstances will be. So how do we handle that? Well, to me, we must memorize and cling to the exhortation of the familiar passage of James 1, verses 2 through 4. Consider it pure joy, not happiness, joy, Happiness is circumstantial based. Joy is the inner gladness that comes from the confidence we have in God. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Why? Because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. So look, the trials of life, not the temptations, those are caused by Satan. The difficulties of life are used by God to do what? To bring us closer to him. But in order for that to happen, we got to trust him. We got to put ourselves out there. We have to have faith that it may turn out perfect, may not turn out perfect. It may cause lots of pain, but that Jesus wants, ultimately what he wants to do is draw us closer to him. And you can't do that if you don't step out in faith. So, how many of us actually do face trials with joy? As I said, joy is that inner gladness from the confidence of Jesus is who he says he is and will do what he says he'll do. We've talked about that before, and you guys should talk about it again today. Certainly, the 12 don't seem to be facing this situation with inner gladness, inner confidence. They're facing it with fear because of what? Because of the uncertainty that lies ahead. How do we actually live, you and I, in the exhortation of James 1, 2-4? Not how should we live it, how do we live it? I want you to detail amongst each other how you in fact live it and how maybe you can better live it. In your discussion, I'm more interested in failures and vulnerability and transparency than I am in boasting about your own successes in this area. None of us are perfect in this area. None of us. Okay, I think we have time for one more section of the passage and still allow you some time for discussion. Verse 17, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the grave for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, hop, skip, and a jump. Many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them with the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. She was too grief-stricken. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, in the verse we already mentioned, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Now, what does this statement by Martha mean to us? Let's think about it. She had asked Jesus to come because she knew he could heal her brother. She had seen him heal others. She had eyewitness evidence. She was disappointed that he did not respond. Then her brother died. Now the circumstances have changed. She could have lost total confidence in Jesus. She could have been angry and may have been. She could have been frustrated and probably was. She could have wallowed in self-pity because things didn't turn out the way she wanted them to. How about us? Yes, it's okay to grieve. Certainly grief is a part of life. But how about it? Do we lose confidence? Do we get angry? Stay angry? Do we get frustrated? Do we wallow in self-pity for a long period of time? Look, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day, just like all the people we know will. Martha had not lost faith in who Jesus ultimately was, and she had simply moved to a set of circumstances which to her, in her finite paradigm, seemed unresolvable. But remember, she hadn't lost faith. In verse 26, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Do you? Do I? Jesus didn't ask her to believe he would raise Lazarus from the dead. He simply wanted to know if she still trusted him. What's our response when things go way off track? Do we still trust him? Do we still believe him? Do we still live for him? Do we still cling to him? Let's see what she says. Verse 27. Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. Martha had not lost faith. Her bond with Jesus was still strong. So must ours be in time of great difficulty. So, verse 28 through 32, she goes home. She collects Mary. She gives Mary a rendition of what's going on. Jesus is still where he was, but Mary goes out and meets him. The Jews noticed how quickly she got up and followed him. And when Mary reached the place, she asked him the same question: Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, I think Mary might have been a little more emotional than Martha. And I think she was just so broken up. That's why she didn't come, to begin with. But look at what happens next. In verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved. Do you see that? Deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. 35, shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. He shed tears. He grieved physically, not just emotionally, for his friend. The Jews even noticed this. See how he loved him? I love that passage. What does it say to us, to you? It is the personification of how much our great God, who has dominion and authority over the universe, cares about each of us individually, deeply. He laughs when we laugh, and he mourns when we mourn. That's how much he loves us. So we're going to stop right there. We'll pick up the rest of the story next time. Please keep us in your prayers. Have a great discussion, and we will see you in a couple of weeks. God bless.